No, but seriously, does the show even make sense anymore? What is House of the Dragon even supposed to be about? According to the trailers for Season 2, which are now nothing short of false advertising, the show is supposed to be a show about war. The trailer, oh so loudly, says, "All must choose." Well, if I am being honest, I am choosing to turn this TV show off, because I rarely encounter such a spineless, toothless way of progressing a story. Season 2 delivered barely anything and was a huge disappointment, and I am not exactly sure that the show itself understands what it actually is. I would go out and say that the show thinks all too highly of itself in some places and comes across as childish in others. I am not sure it understands how war, world building, or even humans work. At this point, the show is just endlessly baffling and confusing. But was the show always this way? Well, no. For the record, I was a huge fan of the first season. In hindsight, I like it just a bit less because now I know where it all leads. Apparently, I was kind of delusional in my original understanding of House of the Dragon in a sense that I kind of overestimated it. Here's how I understood the first season of House of the Dragon. It is a story of a succession war, but it is also a story of a family. Shocking, I know. But I really, at least initially, liked the way the story was told. First of all, the vibes were vibing, they were absolutely immaculate. The production was excellent. It was kind of like The Crown to me, but in the case of House of the Dragon, this isn't really a flex. So within the show, there exists a whole politics and there exists a whole personal drama between characters. There is a relationship between the two. Personal relationships are influenced by the politics, and the politics are influenced by relationships. It is a symbiotic relationship between these two, and all of that is great. The interesting part of all of this for me is not entirely the politics, but the way these royals influence them. Targaryens get up to all sorts of stuff in the first season, like Daemon living out his petty drama with his broski and having beef with the entirety of King's Landing. What is inherently intriguing is how this privileged family can do whatever they like and either really harm or really improve the realm. They happen to live under the grand delusion that they have some right to rule over everyone, and they consistently use these delusions as an excuse to justify themselves to do things the way they like. Sure, it may not explicitly come across as that, since everyone talks in very rosy dialogues and carry themselves in a very fancy way, but that is what it essentially is. Where the hell am I going with this? The first season is very effective in setting up a lot of the beef between characters. So whatever huge conflict is coming is not only deeply political, but it is also very deeply personal. I think it is also crucial to understand that this season was hailed as a prologue to a larger story. Ballsy move, but they did have enough mainstream attention to be able to have this prologue. Not a lot of shows can do that, but they did. And I think that for what it was, it worked out. Now, the absolute best episodes for me in the season were the last 3. I do have some quarrel with them, and they are certainly not perfect. But the sheer amount of vibes they put out, it is great. In episode 8, I love the scene of Viserys' Last Supper. It is very interesting to see all these characters interact with one another in a little calm before the storm moment, even if they are somewhat pretending. Damn, splitting the final 2 episodes between the teams is also an excellent choice. The death of Viserys kicks off a chain of events and the succession war begins. The vibes are, again, immaculate. This is what the show should always be from now onwards. But there are 2 whoopsies and miscommunications that happen in these 3 episodes. One of them I love, and the other I have come now to hate with all my heart. The thing that really sets the shit train in motion is when Aemon does a whoopsie and accidentally kills Luke. The show served some realness and I was freaking intrigued. The miscommunication comes in episode 8. Alicent basically goes to her barely breathing husband and he murmurs something Aegon, the name of her son.
Aegon.
Our son.
His dream. Prince that was promised.
So she basically takes this as a green light to do whatever the hell she likes, aka to install her son onto the throne. So the next episode, when Viserys finally kicks the bucket, she sits there in the council all sad and googly-eyed as she tells everyone this. The sequence of events is kinda decent. I am not exactly trembling at the genius of the writing, but it's decent. So here's how I always viewed Alicent in the show. I personally was always of the opinion that Alicent used religion more as a little coping device to justify herself, as well as a bit of a vehicle to rationalize the world around her. And I think this isn't some grand revelation. It is partly why I was kind of intrigued by the friendship that Rhaenyra and Alicent had. There is a stark contrast between the two of them in a sense that Rhae had a father who actually gave a damn about her. Meanwhile, Alicent was in the trenches being micromanaged by Otto. Rhae had freedom. Alicent didn't, so there is obvious place for resentment there. I always felt like, at least in some way, the religious thing that Alicent is obsessed with is also a vehicle for her to feel superior to Rhaenyra. I don't think I am reinventing the wheel here. The show repeatedly repeatedly displays that Alicent is fast to judge Rhae whenever she likes, not necessarily always without any sound basis. She has a raging, throbbing hate boner for whenever Rhae does anything that even remotely symbolizes the freedom that Alicent doesn't have after the time jump. The contempt there is palpable, but the religion thing always read to me as a way to rationalize that hatred. We saw this mask slip during the Driftmark episode, and that was great, that was epic. So that is how I also interpreted her being so quick to just accept whatever her husband says. Anyone with a shred of sanity would see that Viserys uttering stuff like that hours before dying shouldn't mean anything. The man barely had half of his face and was barely conscious already. This reads as Alicent's very high-end rationalizing of her own acrimony towards Rhaenyra, and whoever else rather than her actually buying it. From this lens, her piss-poor attempt at using psyops with that page on Rhaenyra to try and coax her into obedience also could read as her trying to justify herself in some messed up way. Because hey, at least she tried. She just honestly seemed fake as hell to me after the time jump. I'm not saying that she wasn't human, it's just that she just seemed a bit iffy to me. Then we also have Rhaenyra herself. There is this little prophecy that is being thrown around in the show. Her dad makes a huge effort to talk about how this is all bigger than her, how she's supposed to unite the realm, whatever that entails. I always saw this as being a certain basis being set up for a potential delusion down the line. And this is where my delusions kick in. Here I thought that the show was going to be smart about what it was doing with these various threads. Here I thought that maybe the show would use all of this to say something smart and have a point. But there was always something that irked me about this show from the very beginning, and it wasn't really a huge issue in season 1, but it was progressing into an issue ever since that one time jump. So let's talk about cynicism and warmongering, because these are the two things that are sorely missing from the show onwards. And this is where a more concrete comparison can be made between The Crown and House of the Dragon. It feels like both shows approach their subjects in exactly the same way. If you didn't know, The Crown is very much into the idea of humanizing the British royal family. I would say that House of the Dragon is also this way, but there is one huge fundamental difference between these two shows. In one of them, the subjects have no real tangible power, while in the other, they are literally on top of the food chain. No shade to The Crown, but The Crown doesn't have too much bite to it at all. All it has is heightened emotions and a lot of drama between characters. Because when you think about it, there is nothing else for them to have except interpersonal conflict and inner turmoil of the characters. Not saying that there wasn't any leeway in that. The Crown had its moments, but it really feels as though House of the Dragon ripped a page out of their book for a lot of how they approach these characters. The Crown has characters parading around with fancy music and costumes contemplating some higher purpose or whatever emotion they are stewing on. House of the Dragon also feels like it has a lot of that. It's just this weird feeling of every little moment being this dramatic showdown or this big character revelation, which is good for the first season. I think part of why I used to like this approach in House of the Dragon is because this is really a personal conflict. On its face, the succession war that is supposed to happen is a perverse one, kin against kin, brother against sister, etc, etc. So I do see why they would bring out all of these dramatics to set up a deep basis for such a conflict. Because yeah, you have to remember that these people are part of the same family. It makes sense for them to have some form of a bond, whatever it is. Having a civil war inside one extended family is already a bit grim, it all makes sense. But the difference between The Crown and House of the Dragon is that House of the Dragon literally has fucking dragons. In The Crown, people are miserable because they are all trapped in a supposed system. As in, the show really emphasizes that they have to watch what they do so that the supposed system doesn't break down or whatever. House of the Dragon does something really similar. We get to see all of our characters feel these moral obligations towards this rose-tinted concept of the people and the realm. We get to see everyone be these ultra-mindful individuals who are so deep invested into the betterment of the realm or whatever. Everyone being so mindful of potential of war breaking out. It is this grand posturing from some members of this royal family that gets to me sometimes, because honestly, it kinda makes no sense for some of them to even be this way. What is severely lacking is the cynicism towards some of these main characters. It is a weird feeling because the show really holds itself back for some reason. It holds this weird reverence towards this family, as if it is scared to actually have a bite in its storytelling. Everything feels so tame. I am not saying that they should be completely terrible, but where is the edge? Where is the edge to some of these characters? The show is based off of the fictional historical accounts of Westeros, and the show really holds this distance from these characters. It kinda reveres them and feels scared to approach them in a raw manner. Somehow, the show approaches them in this stupidly genuine and sometimes naive way, and this lack of cynicism makes everything so much dumber in season 2. So there is this now infamous scene of Rhae coming to the little temple where she decides to talk to Alicent. The scene is dumb, there is no doubt in that, but you would think that at least the contents of it would redeem it. But no, So the writers find a way for Alicent to drop the famous last words of Viserys, and Rhae recognizes it since Viserys also told her the prophecy or whatever. Then Rhae tells her what the words actually mean, and Alicent responds in this.
The Conqueror. You must go before you are discovered.
There's been a mistake.
There's been no mistake.
Please, do not let your pride blind you.
There's been no mistake. It's too late, Rhaenyra.
Alicent.
I liked the idea of the war being inevitable, but I strongly disliked the delivery from Alicent because it suggests that she actually believed Viserys, which is kind of very stupid and removes a lot of the complexity from her actions. It would have been way more interesting to see her deny that shit to Rhaenyra's face and stick to her guns even if she deep down knows that Viserys was just yapping without thought. It would have suggested that she was using her piety as a device to justify herself in her waging the entire war in the first place. It wouldn't necessarily nullify the starting point of her character actually being genuine. She didn't start out being malicious, she was pushed into it by her dad. But that doesn't mean years spent in King's Landing wouldn't have corrupted her. This shouldn't have been a moment where her belief system came crashing down, because honestly, what belief system? This, at least in my delusion, should have been a moment where her mask slips. I mean, the entire second season should have been full masks off in the entire family now that all the tensions had reached a breaking point. But apparently she was just a religious nut all along. It would have been a nice little commentary on how actual wars in real life were waged over whatever a holy book had to say, serving as a mask to hide people's affinity to hatred and just cruelty, or how people in general cling onto whatever rationalizations they can to justify themselves. And there still exist people who hide their hatred and justify their vile actions under the premises of religion or whatever words they wanted to hear from someone. Have Alicent's veneer of piety be exposed and have her be blinded by the hate she already has. Have her even be power hungry in the middle of it all. Why is it so bad that she would actually have ambition? If you want her to be paranoid as well, have it. It doesn't conflict with anything. That is what season 1 kinda sorta did at least. And season 2 goes ahead and tells you that Alicent actually has deep morals and she's actually deep into the religious stuff. Does it make sense? Kinda sorta, but it also just makes her seem really stupid and lacking any actual backbone. To make her actually believe Viserys is very reductive of her. If this was the intention, well, they certainly achieved it. Same could be said about the prophecy of the prince that was promised and Rhaenyra. I kinda sort of wish they would have played up that aspect of her holding this belief that she is the one who has to be on the throne because of that prophecy. Have her go mad a bit with the idea of her being the only one able to unite. Very out there idea, and they might be going for it in the future. But God, at least do something that would suggest something more interesting. But to have these nice things, we would also need to make bold assertions about Rhae and Alicent and actually make them nuanced. And we cannot do that now, can we? I don't understand why they made Alicent so genuine in her beliefs at all. So let's talk about something called gaslighting. Remember the finale of season 1? You know, where Rhaenyra prepares for war yet does nothing, and we get the moment of her finding out her son was killed by her opponent, and this obviously means that this is now war? Well, if you thought that, season 2 has news for you. Alicent's arc, while being only one piece of this larger tapestry of nonsense, perfectly exemplifies everything that the show gets wrong about this entire conflict. Alicent is portrayed as the super aware person who has the strong sense of guilt over the entire situation. But why? The entirety of the second season is honestly absurd in this sense, because people keep saying that it is already war, but there is barely anything being done to actually fight the war. People who actually do want to fight the war are constantly punished by the narrative and portrayed as being wrong. People instead spend so much time talking about war, grieving over war which hasn't even fully come to pass. And what really bothers me is that the show has this really modern approach to the whole plot. Now, this might be a hot and canonically brain-dead take, but even from the world-building perspective, I am not exactly sure that it makes sense that everyone would be this hyper-aware in what the war would do. I guess what I am saying is that there should be more moments where characters are out of touch, and this really shows with Rhaenyra. Alicent's faults were already explained as her being misguided rather than being evil. With Rhaenyra, it is kinda the same. The show decides that she cannot have any faults, and that she is the perfect ruler forced into this situation by everyone around her. Okay, might be an exaggeration, but she wants to avoid bloodshed and war and is looking out for everyone at the same time. She compromises herself stupidly by going to King's Landing for a meet and greet with Alicent. But I, honest to God, find it hard to believe that if the show was honest about her, she would be this way at all. The thing that I liked throughout the first season, and sometimes the second, is that the show really dug into the fact that they are at a peacetime. A king before ensured that peace, and generations got to live that peace. Peace is also usually taken by granted by those who didn't themselves achieve it. And history also shows that we as people forget what it actually takes to get to the point of peace. So from where I'm sitting, there isn't really enough reason for Rhaenyra to be this woke about the war. This isn't her trying to prevent World War III. She isn't a representative at the United Nations. There isn't some other war that she has a memory of. Out of the disappointment that was the second season, the one strand that I really liked was the reaction that Cole had after the first major fight. The dude seemed shell-shocked at the sheer intensity of it, and that is how it should be. He went looking for war and got it. Did not like it because the situation finally gained the gravity that it had because he was actually there and experienced it. Do I want everyone to suddenly be warmongering maniacs? No, but at least show that bit of a disconnect. It would have been an interesting thing to add because I think it is kind of realistic for wars to break out from rulers who don't understand a thing about maintaining actual peace. There should have been a sense of entitlement about Rhaenyra because she was simply handed peace already and she doesn't know shit about it. I still think, and I will stand by the notion that the best Rhaenyra was the young Rhaenyra, because the show dared to display how entitled and arrogant she was, and it makes sense. She literally owns a dragon that can obliterate anything in this world. She has riches, she is royalty, yet the show decides to delegate it as a byproduct of not being mature enough rather than keeping it a consistent character trait. I do not get how Rhaenyra suddenly grows out these traits while essentially remaining in the same bubble of royalty she was always in. There's one scene that I loved with young Rhaenyra, when she's out in town and she comments about how she doesn't really care for what the small folk think.
Many of the small folk are like to believe that as a male, Aegon should be the heir.
Their wants are of no consequence.
And it makes sense. This is how it should be. There is an argument to be made about how she has experienced a lot between her teen and adult self, and that argument is valid, I'm not invalidating that. But I really don't see how experiencing loss and having pregnancies would humble her and make her so down to earth and hyper-aware and enrich her with this unfathomable amounts of wisdom and insight about ruling a kingdom. Would it blunt some of her ferocity? Yes, but certainly not her inherent privilege. I mean, privilege should lead to her ambition to actually rule, and she doesn't really seem ambitious enough to actually win this war. She just expects for it to somehow end up at her feet. I think in this way Rhaenyra is entitled as hell, but the show doesn't recognize this at all. She thinks she has a right to the throne because she has this divine right and that her dad left it for her. She's under delusion that she and her family are the rightful rulers of the Seven Kingdoms. This applies to all other characters who are out for the throne. They think that they should be up there due to their own arbitrary reasons and have the right to rule over everyone else. This in itself is already extremely deluded, but the show has done everything it can in its power to show that she is the rightful heir. Which brings us to Daemon's arc in the second season. So he goes off into a little side quest of his own to Harrenhal and then proceeds to see visions. At the end of these delusions, Daemon goes to touch a magical tree and then he proceeds to see a grand vision. Now listen, I appreciate the show's supernatural element. I mean, dragons are not exactly realistic, so it's not inevitable that the show would embrace mysticism along the way. But I do particularly dislike this little sequence, because it essentially solidifies the validity of the main prophecy. The prophecy that I am referring to is said to Rhaenyra by her dad all the way in the first episode of the show. Something needing to unite the realm, whatever. This prophecy is at the core of the entire misunderstanding between Alicent and Rhaenyra in that god-awful exchange at the church. But what this whole thing with Daemon does is basically give visual, irrefutable proof that Rhaenyra is the one to be the ruler. The magic tree is not entirely explained in how it works, but I assume it isn't out there lying to people. I mean, it allowed Daemon to FaceTime Helena, so I assume it works properly? What I would have preferred is something more opaque, because when you think about it, the prophecy never specifies in itself that Rhaenyra is the one needed to lead the realm, and I strongly dislike the fact that the show doesn't fight on this point more. Alicent doesn't really have a reason to immediately have her beliefs crumble or whatever after learning that it is a prophecy, because her children are equally as Targaryens as Rhaenyra. Any one of them could be vital to the prophecy. The show doesn't think this. The show chooses to insist on Rhaenyra being the one who needs to make the prophecy happen. They do the exact same thing that they did with Alicent, but in a positive way. They make her sincere in her belief, and the text supports her belief as if it is the correct one. A prophecy, just like some religion, is also just an excuse for Rhaenyra to justify herself. I don't think it should be as earnest as the show wants it to be. Which also brings us back to the god-awful marketing campaign surrounding the entire show. The second season made a huge deal about there being two sides in this war, and that all must choose. Sure, the trailers may give you the illusion of a choice, but the show itself has already chosen what it supports, and it certainly isn't the Greens. I will expose myself and say that I haven't read the source material of this TV show, if it wasn't already obvious. So it is extra baffling to me that people are even taking any stances within this conflict in the show at all. Right from the first season, the show basically flashed bright neon signs that you should root for Rhaenyra's claim, and I want to emphasize emphasize the word claim here. There is an interesting distinction to be made between rooting for individual characters and rooting for one of the two main claims towards the throne, because you can certainly root for the Hightower side of the characters. I think Season 1 establishes enough sympathy for them, for you to be able to relate to them a bit. But for me personally, that never translated towards the support for their claim. Their entire basis is rooted in traditionalism and upholding the status quo. Rhaenyra's claim is rooted in what her dad said, in upsetting the status quo, but the show added additional padding to support her claim. They also made her this morally upstanding individual who's also so restrained and coordinated that surely you cannot help but support her even if her children are bastards. And this is all before we get to some of the character writing within the show. The main claimants towards the throne are not Rhaenyra and Alicent, but rather Rhaenyra and Aegon. Alicent, whilst not even being a claimant, however, is given way more attention than Aegon. You can really feel this with the whole blood and cheese deal. What happens during it is that Aegon, not too dissimilar from Rhaenyra, loses his son. A bit of a son for a son situation. There is a clear parallel there, and all of that is fine. What is not entirely fine is that the show approaches these two situations similarly, but it gives way more development on it and barely any for Aegon. Rhaenyra was already shown to actually care for her kids, so when Luke got eaten by Vhagar, the grief was very palpable. The show invested time into this. With Aegon, however, things are a bit funny. We saw equal to 0 screen time of him with his kids during the first season. The second season, however, suddenly shows him giving a shit about his kids. He goes around in the castle looking for his son to bring him to a council meeting, and he begins acting like he cares, and that is how you know that a kid won't last. And this is a personal pet peeve of mine when shows do this. They suddenly decide to give some character or some relationship depth right before they decide to kill someone off, and this is supposed to elicit sympathy or something. And then when it happens, we see Aegon react and cry and smash the fancy Lego set, and I won't lie to you, I didn't really feel much. You could write down, "A father had his son murdered" on a piece of paper and give it to me to read, and I would feel the same amount of attachment and sympathy towards it as I did towards Aegon in this scene. Yes, I understand that the situation is sad, and I feel for it in the general sense that yeah, this is very traumatic, but I don't feel anything for Aegon himself going through this. We also see other characters cry about it, but I honestly did not feel very moved by that. The show also moves on from it pretty damn fast. I'm sorry, but I'm just not invested in something that wasn't properly developed, and I don't think I am wrong in this. So I am not exactly participating in the whole greens versus blacks thing, because the show is pretty damn clear about such a thing not even really existing. I won't pretend that the show is attempting to balance the scale when the scale so far is so overwhelmingly in the favor of blacks. And lastly, we get to the biggest pet peeve in this entire situation. I want to close this all off with a funny little anecdote. I have never seen Game of Thrones. Okay. I tried watching it, but I never finished it and already forgot everything, so it's the same thing. Listen, I was 10 when it began airing. Yes, I know I'm a child. Then it was being shoved down my throat by internet and people I knew, and I just got discouraged. Because I thought I was cool and I didn't give in to the peer pressure. It's fun. Then the whole media extravaganza over the final season happens, and I get a good chuckle by having averted such a tragic fate by not engaging. Yay me, right? Then HBO drops the first ever teaser for House of the Dragon. The pitch sounds like something I would kind of enjoy. The teaser looks sick. And then, you know, I begin talking with people I know that, hey look, they are releasing a new Game of Thrones series, ain't that cool? And then everyone collectively said no. 90% of the people, and I'm not joking here, who are formerly fans of Game of Thrones said that they wouldn't watch anything in that universe ever again. Honest to God, everyone almost unanimously decided to ditch the franchise. But we already established that I am different. What am I, a sheep? I am certainly not going to listen to some jaded former fans now, will I? I am unique. I am smarter than them. I am divergent. Fear doesn't shut me down, it wakes me up. So I sat down, and I watched both seasons of the show every week like a good little boy, and I feel like after 2 seasons, there's a sense of irony in there that I am too tired to uncover, but I think the situation becomes 10 times funnier when you realize that House of the Dragon is my first entry into Westeros. So let's talk about being a clown. I have seen a very particular defense being brought up during the second season. Whenever someone says that this season didn't have enough, you know, war, someone crops up and says, well, this season was just a build-up. First of all, as if it wasn't already frigging obvious. Second of all, what? Actually, what? I was told that season 1 was the setup and season 2 is gonna be the main story. What happened to all the talk about season 1 being the prologue? If this is the setup, then what were we doing during the first season? Now here's the real kicker for me. Season 2 kinda shoots season 1 in the foot. We established that season 1 was a setup for a deeply personal story, right? Meaning it had a lot of emotions attached to the conflict at hand. Well, season 2 flushes everything away in a sense that, one of the most emotional things to happen, the death of Lucerys, doesn't even do anything much. This should have been a complete breaking point for everyone involved. This should have been the moment where every little piece of buildup was to pop off, and all of the niceties be foregone. That one death encapsulated a lot more than just a death. It had so many strings attached. But having Rhaenyra forget about it like an episode or two later means that all of that emotional buildup was for nothing. Season 1 was kind of for nothing. It really makes you wonder after a bit, what are we even doing here? I feel like me not having seen Game of Thrones nor having really read any source material and therefore not really having any heavy expectation would make me a great candidate to watch the show. I am not sitting there constantly comparing it against anything. I am not expecting something to be made or done a certain way. I am completely open-minded, but the show is honestly just not worth it. I cannot believe that I sat through 2 seasons, only at the end of the season 2 for them to finally firmly confirm that there is indeed a full-on war happening. And what bothers me even more is not even the fact that these 2 seasons were only really setups. No. What bothers me is that it is not even a good setup. Am I the only one thinking that? Is it a crazy opinion to hold? I have absolutely no desire to continue with the show because it has no substance to it. The story is so overly simplistic, it doesn't have that much nuance, nor is there anything interesting in it. The supposed teams and claims do not even exist anymore. Aegon fucked off somewhere. Alicent gave up her team. Team Green is no more except for Aemon, the only person who actually gives a shit about anything. Rhaenyra is already the most legitimate candidate to have ever graced Westeros. What is there even to watch? So now, having watched the 2 seasons of the show, I can finally put on my red wig, white paint, and a red nose, and embrace my clown Sona. The end.